So imagine walking into the veterinary clinic that you've, taken your golden retriever to for the last decade.
Right.
You pull into the same parking lot. The faded, hand-painted wooden sign with the paw print is still hanging right there above the door.
Yeah, everything looks totally normal on the outside.
Exactly. And the waiting room still has that same, slightly worn, comforting smell of dog treats and antiseptic. But the moment you walk up to the counter, something feels incredibly off.
You can just sense it.
Yeah. The receptionist, who used to know you by name, who used to ask about your kids, she's gone. And in her place is a stressed-looking new hire staring blankly at this sprawling, overly complex software interface.
Which is usually crashing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask to squeeze in an appointment because, I don't know, your dog is acting lethargic, she doesn't check with the doctor in the back, she tells you that all scheduling is now handled through a centralized regional call center.
And hands you an 800 number.
Yes. She hands you an 800 number. And when you finally do see a vet, it's someone you've never met. They seem incredibly rushed. And your bill for a standard checkup suddenly includes, 3 new mandatory administrative fees that didn't exist 6 months ago.
It's jarring.
It really is. And what you don't know, what no one told you, is that your trusted local vet clinic doesn't really exist anymore. It is essentially a ghost ship.
It's a profoundly disorienting experience. I mean, you feel this structural shift in your bones long before you can actually articulate what happened to the business. You just assume, well, maybe the old owner got greedy or they hired a bad office manager.
Right, you just think, man, this place really went downhill lately.
Okay.
But the mission of our deep dive today is to pull back the curtain on that exact feeling. Because what you are experiencing in that vet clinic or at your local daycare center or even the family-run funeral home on the corner, it isn't just a simple story about a business casually changing hands.
Not at all.
It is a highly specific, highly engineered system design that is silently taking over virtually every town in America. We are unpacking the nuts and bolts of the private equity roll-up.
And, right off the bat, we really need to establish a very clear framework before we dive into the machinery of how this all works, because we are not here to say that private equity is inherently evil,
Right.
or that consolidation is always some sort of disaster. I mean, if a private equity sponsor buys up, say, 30 commercial landscaping companies or 20 regional cardboard manufacturers, they might genuinely streamline operations.
Make things more efficient.
Exactly. Upgrade the trucking fleets, make the whole enterprise run better. And sometimes these firms provide absolutely critical capital to a struggling business. Or they offer a clean succession plan for a 70-year-old founder who wants to retire, but, his kids have zero interest in running the family plumbing business.
Yeah, let's draw that line really clearly. Because if we're just talking about consolidating window washers or cardboard boxes, the stakes for me as a consumer are pretty low. Like if my window washer's corporate parent goes bankrupt, my windows just stay dirty for an extra week while I find a new guy on Yelp. It's not a tragedy.
Precisely. But the dynamic changes completely when this specific financial playbook is applied to what we call trust-heavy, labor-sensitive, locally essential services.
Okay, trust-heavy. Like what?
We're talking about emergency medicine, dentistry, childcare, veterinary clinics. In those sectors, the consumer is uniquely vulnerable. I mean, you cannot comparison shop when you are having a heart attack.
No, definitely not.
Or when your pet is having a seizure. You have to rely on trust. And when you subject those delicate local institutions to an aggressive financial model designed to extract maximum yield, the downside risk is almost entirely dumped onto the community, while the upside, the profit, is captured privately.
Okay, so I really want to understand the actual blueprint of the machine that bought my hypothetical vet clinic. Because the prevailing narrative you always hear is just, oh, a big corporation bought them to cut costs.
Right.
But that feels way too simplistic.
Right.
What actually is a roll-up structurally? Like, what is the mechanism at play here?
To understand the mechanism, you have to completely discard the idea that a private equity firm is buying a local business to run a local business.
Okay.
That is the foundational myth. They are doing something entirely different. They are executing a strategy designed to convert dozens or even hundreds of small independent businesses into one massive unified financial platform.
So they aren't interested in the local aspect at all?
Not at all. The moment the ink dries on that acquisition contract, The original business basically ceases to exist as an independent organism. It is instantly converted into a node.
A node, like in a computer network.
Exactly, a node in a much larger network. And this machine, this conversion process, relies on 4 distinct operational pillars.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first one? Yeah.
The first one is scale. So let's say you have 20 independent dental clinics scattered across the state. Historically, every single one of those clinics has its own back office.
Right.
They all have their own payroll processor, their own local accountant, their own marketing budget, their own compliance officer making sure they are up to code.
Which, to be fair, does sound incredibly redundant.
Oh, it is redundant. So the roll-up steps in and centralizes all of it. They fire the local accountants, they eliminate the local marketing budgets, and they build one single massive shared services center in another state that handles the back office work for all 20 clinics simultaneously.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
Consolidating 20 different payroll systems into one sounds like business 101. That just sounds like smart efficiency.
On a spreadsheet, it is brilliant. It looks like pure margin improvement. But that brings us to the second pillar, which is bargaining power.
Bargaining power.
Yeah. A single local dentist has absolutely zero leverage when negotiating with a massive insurance company like Delta Dental, or when trying to get a discount from a supplier on X-ray machines. They have to take whatever price is dictated to them.
Because they're just one person.
Exactly. But a newly formed corporate platform that owns 200 dental clinics across the region, they suddenly have massive leverage. They can walk into a negotiation with suppliers and demand 30% off all medical equipment. Or they can aggressively renegotiate reimbursement rates with insurers.
And let me guess, when they secure that massive 30% discount on X-ray machines, my copay at the dentist doesn't magically drop by 30%.
Not a chance. The data shows overwhelmingly that those savings are captured entirely as profit for the platform.
Shocker.
Right. But it's a third pillar where the friction really starts to hit the consumer, and that is what the industry calls professionalization.
Oof. I'm always inherently suspicious when a corporation uses the word professionalize. It usually feels like a polite euphemism for flattening all the weird, charming uniqueness out of a place.
It is a classic double-edged sword. I mean, to the financial sponsor, professionalization means implementing standardized compliance, cleaner financial reporting, strict corporate governance.
Sure.
But on the ground, in the actual clinic or daycare, professionalization means replacing local human discretion with rigid, centralized control.
It makes me think of those incredible local diners. Imagine you take 20 unique local restaurants, each with a chef who has handwritten recipes they've perfected over 20 years.
Yeah.
Professionalization is walking in, taking all those recipes, throwing them in the trash, and forcing every single location to serve the exact same pre-packaged meals, cooked using the exact same microwave settings, just so a remote manager 3 time zones away can track the cook times on a dashboard. You haven't made the food better, you've just made it uniform.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it, because uniformity is the absolute goal. Local variation is viewed strictly as an inefficiency that needs to be solved. But those first 3 pillars, scale, bargaining power, professionalization, they're really just the setup.
Just the plumbing.
Just the plumbing.
Uh-huh.
The entire reason this machine exists, the absolute financial heart of the roll-up model, is the 4th pillar. It's called multiple expansion.
Hold on, slow down here, because I think this is the magic trick of the whole industry. Explain multiple expansion to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Because from what I understand from the reading, this is how billions of dollars are generated almost out of thin air.
It absolutely is a financial magic trick. Let's walk through a concrete example.
Okay.
Let's say you own a very successful independent local HVAC repair company. You fix air conditioners and furnaces. At the end of the year, after paying all your staff and your expenses, your business generates $1 million in pure profit.
Sounds like a great business.
It is. Now, if you want to sell that business, how much is it worth? In the world of finance, businesses are valued as a multiple of their profit. A small, independent, single-location business like yours might be valued at a multiple of 4.
So 4 times my $1 million in profit, my company is worth $4 million.
Correct. And it's valued at a 4 multiple because it's a risky asset.
Yeah.
It's small, it's highly reliant on you as the founder, and if a competitor moves across the street, you could be in trouble. It is essentially illiquid.
Makes sense.
But let's look at a...
Okay, I think I see where this is going. If I'm the private equity firm, I run around town and I buy 10 small HVAC companies for $4 million each.
Yep.
I just spent $40 million.
Yes. And let's assume you don't change a single thing about how they fix air conditioners. You don't innovate the service at all. You just glue them all together under one new corporate umbrella, plug them into your centralized back office, and suddenly you don't own 10 small, risky businesses. You own one mid-sized platform generating $10 million in profit.
Because 10 times 1 million.
Right. And because it is now a larger institutional asset, the market says it is now worth a multiple of 12.
12 times 10 million. That combined company is now worth $120 million. Wait, I bought the pieces for 40 million? I literally didn't change the underlying service, and now I can sell the whole package for 120 million.
You have just discovered valuation arbitrage, that is, multiple expansion. You aren't necessarily making the business fundamentally better at its core function. You are fundamentally repricing the cash flow by changing the structural wrapper it sits inside.
That is staggering. It's literally financial alchemy. But buying up all those businesses in the first place requires an unbelievable amount of upfront capital. Which brings us to the catch, right? The danger of the debt they used to do this.
This is the critical vulnerability of the entire system: leverage. Private equity firms do not use entirely their own money to buy these small businesses.
Of course not.
They use a small amount of their own equity and they borrow the rest from lenders. They load the newly formed platform company up with massive amounts of debt to finance the aggressive acquisition spree. If the multiple expansion trick works, the returns on the small amount of cash the private equity firm actually put in are astronomical. But it introduces a monumental risk to the underlying business.
Let's break that down. Because I hear the term risk thrown around constantly in finance, but it feels so abstract. If I'm taking my kid to a corporately owned daycare, what does their debt risk actually mean for me?
It means we have to understand the difference between operating risk and capital structure risk. This is where most casual observers get deeply confused. People look at a local pediatric clinic or an HVAC company in the dead of winter, and they think, well, kids will always get sick and furnaces will always break. The demand is permanent, therefore this business is incredibly safe.
Right. They think it has almost zero operating risk.
Exactly.
It's not like they're selling a trendy tech gadget that might go out of style next year. They're selling emergency services.
Precisely. The operating risk is very low. But stable consumer demand does not equal a safe business if the capital structure risk is completely toxic.
Capital structure risk.
Yeah.
So the financial architecture built on top of the business.
Yes. Think of the local business as a healthy, strong horse.
Yeah.
It can pull a wagon all day long. That's low operating risk. But if you suddenly load 5,000 pounds of blocks into that wagon, the horse is going to collapse and die. The horse didn't fail because it forgot how to walk. It failed because the load it was forced to carry was simply too heavy.
Wow.
A business can have a line of eager, paying customers out the door, generating great revenue, and still go totally bankrupt because the debt stack layered on top of it requires interest payments that consume every single dollar of profit.
That is a terrifying distinction. The business doesn't fail because people stopped wanting the service. It fails because the financial wrapper it was placed inside suffocated it.
Exactly. A local vet clinic that was perfectly stable and profitable for 40 years as a small, debt-free enterprise suddenly becomes highly unstable as a node in a heavily leveraged system. The margin for error just vanishes overnight.
Okay, so now that we understand the actual anatomy of this machine, the centralization, the multiple expansion alchemy, and the heavy use of debt, I want to look at the timeline. Because it feels like a switch was flipped somewhere around, I don't know, 2012 or 2013, and suddenly this model was deployed in basically every zip code in America. Why the explosion? Why didn't they do this in 1995?
It was a perfect storm, driven entirely by the global macro environment following the 2008 financial crisis. For the last 10 to 15 years, we lived in an unprecedented era of historically cheap money.
Right. Interest rates were basically at the floor.
Exactly. Central banks pushed interest rates down to near zero. Credit wasn't just available, it was practically free, and it was everywhere.
So if you're an investor, you can't just put your money in a savings account or a safe bond anymore because it earns 0%. You are desperate to find a return anywhere you can.
Investors were starved for yield. So billions upon billions of dollars flooded into private equity funds. And those private equity sponsors, now sitting on mountains of cash and armed with incredibly cheap debt, went hunting. And they were specifically hunting for businesses that seemed defensive and stable.
So if I'm one of those private equity sponsors, what does my ideal target look like? Obviously, I'm not trying to buy out Google or Apple. What is the profile of the perfect industry to roll up?
You are looking for a very specific set of characteristics. First, you need a fragmented market. You do not want to enter an industry dominated by three massive corporate giants who will fight you. You want an industry composed of thousands of independent mom-and-pop shops.
Makes sense.
Second, you want recurring, persistent demand. Services people need regardless of whether the stock market is up or down.
Which is why healthcare and home repair are so juicy.
Exactly. Third, and this is crucial, you look for demographic succession crises.
Like demographic succession?
Yeah, think about the baby boomer generation. You had thousands and thousands of independent dentists, optometrists, and plumbers who started their businesses in the 70s and 80s. Now they are hitting retirement age.
Yep.
Their kids went to college to become software engineers and have absolutely zero desire to take over the family plumbing business. That creates a massive motivated pipeline of sellers.
And fourth, I imagine they're looking for that administrative messiness we talked about earlier.
They love administrative friction. When they see a disorganized local back office with paper files and a part-time bookkeeper, they don't see a charming local quirk. They see immediate, actionable margin opportunity.
Just ripe for centralization.
Right. And finally, they look for intense local brand trust that they can quietly capitalize on. They want to buy the clinic that everyone in town trusts, keep the founder's name on the building, but secretly swap out the engine behind the drywall.
I have a conceptual question, though. A child care center managing toddlers, an HVAC company fixing furnaces, and a gastroenterologist performing endoscopies. They have literally nothing in common in terms of day-to-day human operations. The skills are entirely different. So why does the exact same private equity financial playbook work for all of them?
Because to a financial engineer building a roll-up, the actual service being rendered is irrelevant. The spreadsheet does not see toddlers or Freon or medical equipment. It only sees structural rhymes.
Structural rhymes. It's an interesting way to put it.
It sees fragmented cash flows. It sees a predictable margin for labor optimization. To the financial model, the input is capital, the mechanism is leverage and centralization, and the output is a higher valuation multiple. Whether the employee is holding a wrench or a stethoscope is completely secondary to the structural assembly of the platform.
And the way they assemble it is incredibly stealthy. Let's talk about the strategy of how they actually buy these places up without triggering massive alarm bells in the community.
The industry uses what is called a platform and add-on strategy, or platform and tuck-in. It is brilliant in its stealth. They don't try to buy 100 clinics on day one. They start by finding one large, very well-run, highly profitable regional business. They buy it, and that becomes the foundational platform.
That's the mothership.
That's the mothership. It provides the initial management team and the IT infrastructure. Then, once the mothership is established, they go out and start gobbling up dozens of smaller tuck-in acquisitions around it. One standalone pediatric clinic here, 2 family funeral homes over there, a tiny local daycare down the street.
And because they are doing it one tiny piece at a time, nobody notices the monopoly forming. Like if 2 massive airline companies try to merge, it is front-page news, the federal government steps in, the FTC launches antitrust investigations. But if a corporate mothership buys one local dentist every Thursday for 5 years,
it completely evades regulatory scrutiny. In the United States, there are financial thresholds for reporting mergers to antitrust regulators. A $2 million acquisition of a local vet clinic falls way below that radar.
wow.
It goes entirely unnoticed until the town wakes up one day and realizes that a single, distant corporate entity secretly owns 80% of the specialty medical practices, or all the emergency vets, in their entire county. The concentration of market power arrives not through a blockbuster headline, but through relentless repetition.
But here is the massive elephant in the room. The macro environment we just talked about, the zero interest rates, the cheap debt, that era is dead. We are now living in a world of much higher interest rates and significantly tighter credit. How is that shock to the system affecting this whole roll-up ecosystem?
It is causing immense structural stress. Remember, these massive platforms were modeled, leveraged, and built for a highly forgiving financial era. Their entire business plan assumed that whenever their massive debt loans came due, they could just easily refinance them at another super low interest rate.
Just kick the can down the road.
Exactly. Now, they've hit what we call a refinancing cliff in a harsh environment. The cost of carrying their debt has skyrocketed. Suddenly, the interest payments are eating all the profit. Furthermore, the exit markets have cooled.
Meaning they can't find a bigger sucker to buy the $120 million platform they built.
Exactly. The music slowed down. And when highly leveraged entity is under financial stress at the top, that pressure flows rapidly down to the bottom.
Which means the pressure on the actual people doing the work, the nurses, the teachers, the mechanics, has to be intensifying. Knowing why these businesses are bought leads us directly to the ground level reality of what happens the day after the ink dries. Let's talk about the squeeze. Let's talk about the actual human experience of the takeover.
The transition usually unfolds in very predictable stages. Stage 1, right after the acquisition is announced, is generally quite benign. In fact, it can feel like a win. Yeah. The old founder gets a massive, life-changing payout, which they often entirely deserve for building the business. The new corporate parent flies in, holds a town hall meeting, hands out branded fleeces, and announces exciting plans for new software and better health benefits. Everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Things seem totally fine.
Okay, so it's the honeymoon phase.
Right. But then comes stage 2. And this involves a concept I find absolutely fascinating, the drive for legibility.
Legibility. Explain what that means in this context.
Legibility is a concept borrowed from political science and anthropology, often associated with James C. Scott. But it applies perfectly to corporate roll-ups. Think about the private equity sponsor. They might own 300 clinics across 20 time zones.
Okay.
The executive sitting in a boardroom in Manhattan cannot possibly fly out to understand the nuanced, idiosyncratic way the local clinic in Tulsa, Oklahoma operates. So, to control the empire, they need every single location to be perfectly countable, comparable, and governable on a standardized spreadsheet. The local business must be made legible to the central system.
So anything unique or quirky or deeply localized about that branch is essentially flagged as a glitch in the matrix.
Precisely. Idiosyncrasies become exceptions. Exceptions become inefficiencies. Inefficiencies become targets for immediate elimination. The system cannot tolerate a local manager doing things their own way because it breaks the dashboard.
Right.
This relentless drive for legibility creates massive, sweeping changes across 4 distinct categories of the business.
Let's explore those changes because this is where the listener actually feels the shift.
Yeah.
Let's start with administrative centralization.
This is the death of local authority. We touched on this earlier. The local receptionist, who used to be the maestro of the waiting room, is stripped of her power. The phone lines get permanently routed to a regional call center.
Which is the worst.
Oh, it is. If a patient or a customer has a complex, messy scheduling issue, something that requires a little human grace or flexibility, the person physically standing in front of them at the front desk literally no longer has the security clearance in the computer system to override the schedule and fix it.
They just have to stare at you and say, I'm sorry, you have to call the 800 number. It's incredibly dehumanizing for both the customer and the employee. What about the actual labor?
That is the second major change, labor redesign. In a locally owned business, labor is usually treated as the core medium of quality. In a roll-up, labor is treated strictly as an input variable to be aggressively optimized. The distant platform imposes standardized, rigid staffing ratios. They implement what we call throughput pressures.
Give me a concrete example of throughput pressure.
Imagine a veterinarian who used to take 30 minutes per appointment, giving them time to calm the dog down and chat with the owner. The corporate platform looks at the data and says, if you reduce that to 15 minutes, we can double our daily billing.
Wow.
Suddenly, the doctor is placed on a literal stopwatch. Their compensation becomes tied to hitting new volume metrics. The pressure to churn through human beings or animals just to meet the corporate debt obligations completely changes the culture of care.
I can imagine the burnout is instantaneous. Then we have software standardization, which on the surface sounds incredibly boring. Like upgrading software shouldn't be a crisis.
It sounds benign, but it is routinely cited as the most agonizing pain point for the staff. Migrating 30 radically different local clinics, all using different legacy systems, onto one massive, monolithic enterprise software platform is a nightmare.
I bet.
It routinely leads to lost medical records, catastrophic billing errors, and staff driven to tears. Because here's the secret. The new software is not designed to make the local nurse's job easier. It is designed for portfolio governance.
Ah, so the executives can see the revenue metrics clearly.
Exactly. Local usability is sacrificed for central legibility.
And the final change is where it hits the consumer's wallet. Revenue optimization.
This is the most aggressive end of the operational spectrum. Revenue optimization involves implementing much more aggressive medical coding to extract maximum insurance payouts. It involves tightening debt collections on struggling patients, and it introduces disciplined, mandatory upselling.
Right. This is when you go to the dentist for a simple cleaning, and suddenly the hygienist is aggressively pitching you a $600 custom night guard, a proprietary water flosser, and an elective whitening treatment, reading from a laminated script.
Exactly. The goal is to extract maximum yield from every single human interaction because the debt load demands it.
So when you combine all of this, the loss of local authority, the throughput pressure, the terrible software, the upselling, what does this do to the actual soul of the business? We need to talk about the concept of Slack, because I think understanding this is the key to the whole deep dive.
Slack is a profound operational concept. In a healthy, locally owned business, there is almost always extra capacity that a strict financial spreadsheet would categorize as waste.
Give me an example of what they call waste.
Maybe the local hospital keeps an extra nurse on staff on Tuesday afternoons just in case there's an emergency. Maybe the office manager spends 20 extra minutes chatting with an elderly patient to ensure they really understand their complex new medication. Maybe the local contractor uses a local supplier who charges 5% more, but who will pick up the phone at 2 a.m. when a pipe bursts.
Right. To anyone living in a community, that's not waste. That's just called being a good, reliable business. That's being a good neighbor.
But to a centralized platform analyzing data from 3,000 miles away, all of that looks like pure, removable, inexcusable waste. They see a nurse standing around, they see a supplier who costs 5% more, and they strip it out. They eliminate it to boost the margin.
And what happens then?
What they entirely fail to understand, or perhaps what they simply don't care about, is that this waste is actually the vital slack that makes the institution resilient and trustworthy. Slack is the shock absorber of an organization. It's the informal problem solving, the deep institutional memory, and the long-term community relationships that keep things running smoothly when times get unexpectedly tough.
I love the shock absorber analogy. Let's expand on that. It's like buying a really comfortable, reliable car and then bringing in a consultant who says, you know, these heavy shock absorbers are adding weight to the vehicle. They are reducing your fuel efficiency. If we rip them out, your miles per gallon will go up by 8%.
Yes, exactly.
And sure, on a spreadsheet, the fuel efficiency looks amazing. The car is technically optimized. But the very first time you hit a pothole on the highway, because you have no shock absorbers, the entire axle snaps in half. The ride becomes incredibly jarring, and eventually the whole machine breaks down.
That is the perfect visualization of the hollowing out process. By systematically removing the slack, the business becomes a brittle, fragile shell. Yes, it might still be operating, the lights are on, the sign is still on the door. But the internal capacity to handle stress, to adapt to a crisis, or to provide deeply personalized, empathetic care has been completely hollowed out.
But the concept of hollowing out a business is just abstract theory until we look at the specific industries where this exact sequence is playing out in real time. We need to map this out. Let's look at the map of the roll-up nation. Where exactly is this model traveling and what is the damage on the ground? Let's start with the big one, healthcare.
Healthcare is by far the most alarming sector, and it's the one with the clearest, most robust evidence base. According to a major 2024 report from the Government Accountability Office, about 6.5% of physicians nationally are now practicing in private equity-owned entities.
I have to be honest, 6.5% doesn't sound like a massive civic crisis to the casual listener. I mean, that means over 90% are still independent or hospital-owned.
That is the national average, which dilutes the severity of the problem. These acquisitions are not spread evenly like peanut butter across the country.
Clustered.
Highly clustered. They're highly concentrated, almost laser-focused, on specific regional markets and highly profitable specialties. In a given mid-sized city, a private equity firm might quietly acquire 80% of all the gastroenterology practices or 75% of the dermatology clinics. In those local markets, they have essentially built a functional monopoly.
And what happens to the patients in those concentrated markets?
The data is stark and undeniable. Comprehensive studies published in JAMA and Health Affairs in 2025 and 2026 tracked the aftermath of these acquisitions. They found that post-acquisition, the prices negotiated with insurers go up significantly. Patient copays and professional fees increase materially.
And what about the doctors themselves?
Perhaps the most damning metric is the physician turnover. It spikes dramatically. The doctors themselves, the highly trained professionals generating the value, they start fleeing these platforms because the working conditions, the throughput pressures, and loss of autonomy become simply unbearable.
Wow. What about dentistry? Because I'll tell you, I drove past my dentist the other day. The old wooden sign with his name on it was gone, replaced by this sleek, purple, highly generic corporate logo that looked exactly like the urgent care down the street. It feels ubiquitous.
Your intuition is entirely backed by the industry data. Dentistry is experiencing a massive wave of consolidation. Health Affairs reported that by 2021, nearly 1 in 8 dentists were affiliated with a private equity-backed organization, and the pace is only accelerating.
Seriously.
Yeah. In 2024 alone, industry trackers recorded at least 161 separate private equity dental deals. It is a modern-day gold rush. Dentistry is the perfect target. It's incredibly fragmented, there is a massive wave of retiring practitioners, and it offers incredible opportunities for revenue optimization through upselling elective procedures.
Let's pivot to veterinary care. This one feels deeply personal to people. People love their pets like their own children. The emotional stakes are incredibly high.
And it is precisely that intense emotional connection that makes veterinary care such a lucrative target. The industry operates on what economists call emotionally inelastic demand.
Meaning you'll pay whatever it takes.
Exactly. If your dog is hit by a car or is having a mysterious seizure at midnight, you are not going to sit in the waiting room opening Yelp to bargain hunt for a cheaper x-ray. You will hand over your credit card and pay whatever they ask to save your animal. The financial engineers know this perfectly well.
So they buy up the emergency vets.
Yes. It became such an aggressive tactic that the Federal Trade Commission actually had to launch a major intervention against a massive private equity firm called JB Consumer Partners.
Oh, I remember reading about that in the sources.
Yeah, right. JB was executing a ruthless serial acquisition strategy, quietly buying up specialized and emergency vet clinics all over the country. The FTC eventually stepped in, forced them to divest certain clinics, and imposed incredibly strict prior approval rules for any future acquisitions. The regulators explicitly cited the danger of these stealthy, localized roll-ups, destroying competition and jacking up life-saving prices for captive pet owners.
Then there's childcare. When I saw this in the research, it stopped me in my tracks. You were talking about the most labor-sensitive, locally essential service imaginable.
Childcare is the fundamental bedrock of social infrastructure. Without it, the economy literally cannot function because parents can't go to work, and it has become a massive target. In March 2026, Senator Jeff Merkley launched a high-profile investigation into companies like KinderCare and the Learning Care Group. These are massive, private equity-controlled childcare platforms that, combined, serve over 365,000 children.
The idea of applying a business model explicitly designed to squeeze margins, reduce slack, and centralize labor to the very people watching infants and toddlers. It just feels incredibly dangerous.
But the political and social stakes are enormous. Families have absolutely zero tolerance for instability in childcare. If the corporate parent cuts the staffing ratios too thin to meet a debt payment and a child is neglected, or if the center suddenly shuts down on a Tuesday morning because of a corporate bankruptcy, the localized chaos is profound.
Another sector that shocked me was funeral homes. But when you think about it through the lens of the model we just discussed, it makes terrifying sense.
It is the ultimate expression of the economic profile we've been talking about. Fragmented local ownership, yes. Persistent, inescapable demand, yes. Emotionally inelastic demand, absolutely.
Yeah, you're not exactly in a shopping mindset.
Exactly. When a family member passes away, you are drowning in grief. You are under intense, immediate time pressure to make arrangements. You simply do not have the cognitive or emotional capacity to drive around town comparison shopping for embalming fees or casket prices.
You just go to the place your family has always gone to, the historic funeral home on Main Street. You have no idea that the local family actually sold it to a massive, multi-state corporate platform 3 years ago.
Exactly. The local name stays on the awning. But behind the scenes, the pricing structure is aggressively altered. The staffing is reduced to bare minimums. The casket options are standardized to maximize margin. Hidden administrative fees are baked into the final invoice. The entire deeply human experience of mourning is subtly corporatized, and the grieving consumer is essentially captive to the machine.
And finally, let's touch on home services. Plumbers, HVAC technicians, roofers, we talked about them earlier.
This provides a really interesting contrast in terms of what failure looks like. The demand for fixing broken toilets or leaking roofs is permanent, so it's a huge target. But when a roll-up fails here, the fallout looks different. In 2025, there was a major Chapter 7 bankruptcy of a massive home services platform called NewPro, operated by Renovo Home Partners. When the crushing weight of their debt finally caused the platform to collapse, it was pure chaos. They left thousands of consumers with half-finished bathroom remodeling projects, shattered kitchens, stolen deposits, and absolutely no recourse.
I'm going to push you on a critical distinction here. because leaving a family with a half-finished kitchen remodeling project is awful. It's a financial nightmare. But earlier, the research mentioned things like the ongoing litigation against U.S. anesthesia partners and the rise of these specialty roll-ups in emergency medicine. Why is the risk so fundamentally different, so much worse in healthcare compared to the HVAC or roofing example?
We have to draw a very sharp, uncompromising distinction between the types of services being financialized. If a commercial janitorial roll-up fails, or if a home contractor platform goes bankrupt and leaves your kitchen a mess, it is incredibly frustrating. It's a massive consumer protection issue, but you will survive. You can find another contractor.
Right.
However, if a highly leveraged roll-up of emergency room staffing or anesthesiology or neonatal care fails, the margin for operational error is non-existent. People's lives are immediately physically at risk.
You can't just pause your heart attack and say, hold on, this hospital's corporate parent is in Chapter 11. Let me drive across town to a different network.
Exactly. When you roll up trust-heavy, locally substitutable services where you have no alternate options in a moment of crisis, a financial failure ceases to be a mere business story. It cascades into a full-blown civic disaster.
Which naturally forces us to confront the ultimate question. What actually happens when the massive debt load finally becomes too heavy and the machine breaks? Let's dive deeply into the anatomy of failure. How does a roll-up die?
To understand how they die, you have to undergo a crucial paradigm shift. You have to realize that in these leveraged models, the business rarely fails in the traditional capitalist sense of the word.
What do you mean by the traditional sense?
Yes. In a normal, healthy, free market, a business fails because consumers stop wanting the product. Blockbuster Video failed because people decided they wanted Netflix. Sears failed because people wanted Amazon. The demand vanished.
Right.
But in a highly leveraged roll-up of pediatricians or local daycares or HVAC techs, the demand does not vanish. People still desperately need doctors. The waiting rooms are full. The business has plenty of revenue. It doesn't die of starvation. It is suffocated by its own capital structure.
So the underlying business is healthy, but the financial parasite attached to it kills the host.
Exactly. And when the platform begins to suffocate, it strains in 5 specific observable ways. First is integration disappointment. The corporate executives promised massive efficiencies, but the new software crashes, the billing gets messy, and the promised savings simply never materialize.
Okay, what's second?
Second is tightening labor. In a service business, the product is the people. If you squeeze their wages or increase their workload with throughput pressures, the best staff quit. Replacing them is incredibly expensive and degrades the quality of the service. Pricing pushback. The financial model assumed they could arbitrarily raise prices by 15% every year. But eventually, the massive insurance payers or the out-of-pocket consumers, they revolt and refuse to pay.
Makes sense. Fourth
is slowing deal flow. The entire valuation trick relies on constant growth. If interest rates rise and they can't afford to keep buying new local clinics to feed the beast, the growth narrative stalls.
And the fifth?
And fifth, the most deadly of all, rising debt and interest costs. The platform hits that refinancing cliff, they can't secure a cheap new loan, and the massive interest payments begin to eat every single dollar of operational cash flow.
So it's not like they just suddenly shut the doors and lock up overnight. It's a process. Walk us through the chronological sequence of this failure, because it's vital for people to recognize it in their own towns.
It is a slow, agonizing, highly predictable process. We can track it across 6 distinct stages. Stage 1 is optimism. The acquisition has just happened. The growth thesis is presented in slick PowerPoint decks. The founder gets paid. Everyone is excited.
The honeymoon phase again.
Yes. Stage 2 is transformation pressure. This is the aggressive drive for legibility we talked about. The new software is installed, centralized control is asserted, and the first waves of local friction begin. Stage 3 is operational disappointment. The grand corporate synergies take way longer than expected. Standardizing human labor proves much harder than standardizing a factory assembly line. Customer complaints start to rise.
At this point, the cracks are showing on the wall, but they are just painting over them.
Right. Then we hit stage 4, financial strain. This stage happens upstream, quietly in the corporate boardrooms. The debt burden becomes terrifyingly heavy relative to the cash the clinics are actually generating. The Wall Street lenders start calling and asking hard questions. This triggers stage 5, which is when the public finally feels the pain. Institutional thinning.
This is the hollowing out you mentioned.
Yes. Total panic sets in at corporate. Strict hiring freezes are implemented. Crucial maintenance on the physical buildings is delayed. The roof leaks. The AC is broken in the waiting room. Staff turnover skyrockets as conditions deteriorate, but they refuse to hire replacements. The business is technically open, but it is running entirely on fumes. It has zero slack left. It cannot handle even the slightest disruption. And finally, the dam breaks. Stage 6, visible crisis.
What does stage 6 look like?
It ends in massive Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings, desperate fire sales of assets, or the outright overnight closure of essential community facilities.
Let's look at the absolute worst-case scenarios of stage 6, the severe case studies that actually made national news. Talk to me about Steward Healthcare in 2024.
Steward Healthcare is the modern poster child for when this leverage roll-up model goes catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. They filed for bankruptcy in 2024, carrying roughly $9 billion in debt.
$9 billion of debt, layered onto local hospitals.
$9 billion. And the scale of the human stakes is hard to fathom. Steward operated 31 hospitals across multiple states. They employed nearly 30,000 healthcare workers and saw over 2 million patients a year. When the debt finally crushed them, it wasn't just a corporate failure, it was a regional health crisis.
I remember reading they had to get bailouts.
Yes. It required massive, unprecedented state intervention. The state of Massachusetts had to inject tens of millions of taxpayer dollars in emergency funding just to keep the physical emergency rooms open and the lights on, while they desperately tried to find buyers for the shattered pieces of the network.
And what about Prospect Medical in 2025?
A depressingly similar story. Another massive hospital network driven into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They were facing liabilities estimated between $1 and $10 billion, embroiled in endless litigation over alleged severe mismanagement and the extraction of funds by the private equity sponsors, while the hospitals themselves literally ran out of basic medical supplies. These are massive, incredibly loud bankruptcies that require literal public bailouts to prevent localized healthcare collapses.
Now, this raises a question that I know I had, and I am certain a lot of listeners are screaming at their phones right now.
Let's hear it.
Let's say a local community hospital or a massive local childcare center is fundamentally profitable. The community desperately needs it. The beds are full. The parents are paying tuition. It is only failing because the distant private equity firm layered billions of dollars of toxic debt onto it. If the corporate parent goes bankrupt, why can't the town or a group of local doctors just let the parent die, buy the local hospital back out of bankruptcy at a steep discount, and return it to independent local ownership? Why can't we just reverse it?
It is the most logical, natural question to ask, but it tragically, fundamentally misunderstands how deeply these roll-up platforms integrate and destroy the underlying businesses. Trying to carve out the local hospital from the bankrupt corporate mothership is like trying to unbake a cake.
Unbake a cake. Explain that.
When you bake a cake, the flour, the eggs, the sugar, they all permanently change state. You can never separate them back into their original bowls. When a private equity firm buys a hospital, they don't just leave it intact. They financially dismantle it.
How so?
For example, they often execute what's called an opco-propco split. They take the immensely valuable physical real estate, the land in the building the hospital sits on, and they sell it off to a completely separate corporate holding company. Then, they force the hospital to lease its own building back at exorbitant, crippling monthly rates just to extract immediate cash.
Wait, so the hospital doesn't even own the dirt it's sitting on anymore?
Exactly. So if you try to buy the hospital back, you are buying an entity that has no assets and a massive lease obligation. Furthermore, the intellectual property is gone. The billing system is permanently tied to a centralized proprietary corporate network that you don't own. The local HR, the local legal compliance team, the local accounting staff, they don't exist anymore. They were all fired 5 years ago and moved to a corporate hub in Dallas.
So the hospital isn't a standalone organism anymore. It's essentially an organ permanently attached to a dying body. And if you try to cut it out and save it, it has no independent life support. It just dies on the table.
That is exactly the horrific reality. The assets are inextricably intertwined, the debt is cross-collateralized across 50 different locations, and the essential local institutional knowledge has been permanently destroyed. That is why you almost never see a successful return to independent ownership. The cake is baked.
That is incredibly bleak. But what about the businesses that don't make the front page of the Wall Street Journal? We talked about the loud bankruptcies like Steward, but the research emphasizes something that is probably far more common, something called service degradation, the quiet failures.
Service degradation might be the most insidious, widespread part of this entire economic phenomenon. Because a business does not actually have to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy to utterly fail its community. In many of these massive roll-ups, the corporate entity manages to successfully refinance its debt. The holding company survives. The business stays open indefinitely. But it has suffered permanent, chronic service degradation.
What does that look like for the consumer?
It looks like a hollow shell. The prices are perpetually 20% higher than they used to be. The staff turnover is constant, so you never see the same nurse or vet twice. The wait times are agonizingly long because they refuse to hire adequate staff. The physical building is slowly falling apart, and the local autonomy to solve your problems is absolute zero. The business survived the financial stress test, but the institution, the trusted, reliable community pillar, died a long time ago.
Wow.
It is a profound failure of institutional function, even while the corporate entity remains technically solvent on Wall Street.
The business survived, but the institution died. Which brings us ultimately to the final consequence for you, the listener, and your neighborhood. When the dust finally settles on this massive decade-long financial experiment, what happens to us?
We can categorize the ultimate outcomes for the consumer into 3 tiers: mild, medium, and severe.
Okay, let's start with mild.
The mild outcome is what most people are experiencing right now: a massive increase in daily friction and impersonality. It becomes much harder to book appointments, you are trapped in annoying phone trees, you face constant upselling, and you lose all continuity of care.
It's just this steady, low-level enshittification of daily life.
Precisely. The medium outcome involves actual shrinking of services. The massive corporate platform looks at the data and decides to unilaterally cut the least profitable service lines. The local hospital stops delivering babies because obstetrics doesn't meet the margin requirements. Staffing depth weakens, and local reliability completely collapses.
Then the severe outcome.
Outright, sudden closure of essential facilities or the distressed, broken platform is quietly absorbed by an even larger, even more distant, even more heavily leveraged corporate mega chain, starting the cycle all over again.
And as we just established with the unbaking the cake metaphor, the permanent tragedy here is that consolidation is a one-way street. These places are never going back to being owned by the family down the street.
It is a permanent structural shift, which leads directly to the destruction of what sociologists call institutional redundancy. This is a vital concept for civic health. Think about a medium-sized town that has 10 independent, locally owned doctor's offices. That town possesses a natural, incredibly robust, shock-absorbing diversity.
Because they aren't connected to each other.
Exactly. If one independent doctor makes a terrible business decision, or gets hacked because they use bad software, or suddenly decides to retire and move to Florida, the other 9 offices are completely fine. They can absorb the overflow. The town is naturally insulated from a single point of failure.
But if a private equity roll-up comes into that same town and buys all 10 of those offices to build a local monopoly,
then the redundancy is annihilated. Now, one bad corporate software update pushed from a headquarters 3 states away, one bad quarterly earnings report, or one failed debt refinancing negotiation with a Wall Street bank takes down the entire town's medical network simultaneously. The community has been entirely unknowingly exposed to the massive financial risk of a distant entity.
So if I'm listening to this and I'm looking around my own town, my own neighborhood, what are the actual warning signs? How do I spot the invisible machine?
You need to watch for rapid serial acquisitions in a previously fragmented market. If 4 local roofing companies all suddenly change ownership in the same year, pay attention. Watch for abrupt centralization. If you suddenly can't call the front desk of your local clinic directly anymore, that's a massive red flag.
What about the staff?
Notice if there is a sudden, unexplained spike in staff churn, especially among the longtime managers, the senior nurses, or the veteran clinicians who have been there for decades. Look for obvious deferred maintenance on the physical buildings. And most importantly, look for increasingly opaque ownership structures, where the cozy, familiar name on the door no longer matches the sterile corporate entity actually processing your credit card payment.
And from a macro policy perspective, what is the takeaway for how we govern this?
The primary takeaway is that our current regulatory framework is dangerously obsolete. We simply cannot evaluate a massive consolidation of 300 local childcare centers using the same relaxed antitrust framework we use to evaluate a merger of 2 tech software companies. We must match our evaluative framework to the specific type of institution at stake.
Right.
For trust-heavy, labor-sensitive, locally essential sectors, the things that keep human beings alive and communities functioning, the legal and economic burden of proof must be set significantly significantly higher before we allow this kind of massive, debt-fueled stealth consolidation to proceed.
If I can try to synthesize the emotional core of this entire deep dive, what we're ultimately talking about is a massive systemic transfer of risk. The financial gains of the roll-up model, the brilliant multiple expansion, the centralized margins, the valuation arbitrage, all of that upside is captured privately by the sponsors and their wealthy investors. But the risks, the degraded service, the loss of community resilience, the exhausted staff, the potential for catastrophic public bankruptcy, those risks are distributed entirely to you, the consumer, and to your local community.
That is the inescapable structural reality of the model: private gains, socialized risks.
It brings me all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation, to that feeling of stepping into diagnostic muddy waters. We want things to be clean. We want the x-ray to show a clean break so we can fix it. But the hollowing out of our local institutions isn't an acute fracture. It doesn't happen overnight. It is a slow, chronic condition.
And it leaves us, I think, with a profound, lingering question to consider. As our society moves deeper and deeper into an era powered by artificial intelligence, complex algorithms, and intense, relentless corporate efficiency, will we eventually wake up and realize that the friction, the so-called waste, and the highly personalized, deeply human idiosyncrasies of our small local businesses were actually the very things that held our civic trust together? What happens to the collective mental health of a community when every single local interaction, from burying a loved one to healing a pet, is ruthlessly optimized for a distant spreadsheet?
Something to think about the next time you walk into a familiar place and realize it's just a node in a machine.